The crack in the granite is no wider than a man's shoulders, and it goes straight back into the mountain like a held breath. Owen Hart, age 7, presses his ear against the stone and says he hears water. His mother thinks he is imagining things. His father is already reaching for the lantern. 3 years earlier, when Silas Heart filed the claim at Granite Pass, the land agent had squinted at the survey and said, "Son, there is nothing there but rock and wind." He was not wrong. He was only wrong about what that meant. Every impossible thing in the territory had been made possible by someone willing to look at the same ground twice. The Harts were about to look twice. The cabin sat on a shelf of land between 2 granite ridges, 40 miles from the nearest town of consequence, and the wind that came through Granite Pass in the autumn of 1887 was the kind that found every gap in the chinking and made the lard pail rattle on its hook all night. Silas Heart had built the cabin himself in the summer of 1884. Using lodgepole pine, he dragged 3 miles on a borrowed mule. It was square and solid and cold in a way that no amount of firewood entirely fixed. Mayra had come to Montana from the Orc settlements east of the Divide. 2 years after the cabin went up, she arrived on the stage with a trunk, a seed tin, and a composed expression that Silas later admitted had unnerved him considerably. She was 23 then, tall and straight-backed, with the deep, warm green skin of the eastern settlement orcs, and amber eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing, until she was ready. She looked at the shelf of land and the 2 ridges and the small square cabin and said, "It will do." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way Orc women said things, with a precision that meant exactly what it meant and nothing more. The cabin would do. The land would do. The man who had built the cabin and filed on the land and ridden 40 miles to meet a stage carrying a woman he had exchanged 4 letters with, he would do as well. Though she did not say that part aloud. The marriage of Silas Heart and Mayra had been arranged through a correspondence service that matched settlers in remote territory with willing partners, regardless of race, for a fee of $2. The service was practical rather than romantic, which suited both of them. Silas needed a partner who could work the land beside him. Mayra needed a place where being Orc was less of an obstacle than it was in the settlements, where Orc families competed for the same thin opportunities and the same tired ground. She had read Silas's letter, describing the shelf and the ridges and the 40-mile distance from town, and had understood immediately that isolation, which most people considered a hardship, was also a kind of freedom. Nobody bothered you when nobody could reach you. The people of Granite Pass had opinions about the marriage, as people in small communities always do. A human man taking an Orc wife was not unheard of in the territory, but it was uncommon enough to generate the particular kind of talk that happens when people have too little to do and too much to say. The talk reached Silas and Mayra in the way such things always reached remote homesteads, late and distorted, and they handled it the way they handled most things, by ignoring it and getting on with the work. By the autumn of 1887, the cabin had a second window, a proper hearth, and Owen, who was 7 years old and given to finding things. He was half Orc, which meant his skin carried a faint green tint that deepened in the summer sun, and his eyes were the amber of his mother's people set in a face shaped more like his father's. He found a bird's nest in the woodpile each spring. He found a coin in the creek bed that turned out to be an old silver piece. He found frogs under flat rocks and odd-shaped pieces of quartz that he kept in a row on the windowsill. Silas said the boy had a diviner's eye. Mayra said he was simply patient, in a way most people were not. If you are listening to this story and you want to hear what they found inside that mountain, subscribe to Human and Orc Girl History right now. Then tap the like button and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. There are more stories like this one, and every single one is worth your time. The soil on the shelf was thin and stubborn. Silas grew oats and kitchen vegetables, but the oat yield was poor most years, and the kitchen garden required hauling creek water 50 yards uphill through the summer. Mayra's Orc strength made the hauling easier than it would have been for a human woman, but easier was not the same as easy, and by the end of each summer, her shoulders ached in a way she did not mention, because mentioning it would not have made them ache less. There was a small income from trapping and from selling cured hides to the trading post at Granite Pass, but it was a narrow living, and they both knew it. The nearest neighbor was the Pruitt family, 2 miles south, who grew wheat on better ground and were not shy about mentioning it. Life was not hard in the breaking kind of way. It was hard in the wearing kind of way, which is sometimes worse because it does not give you the dignity of a single dramatic failure. It just grinds, day after day, small disappointments stacked on top of each other until the pile is taller than you realized and you cannot remember when it started. The crack appeared in the east-facing granite wall, the autumn Owen turned 7, though Silas believed it had always been there, and they had simply stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a fence post you walk past every day. But I probably make it as if I do what I do now, because I've been removed from it for this purpose, because I've been living for this, and I've been so far as I could, and I've been so far from my dead part. Owen found it on a Saturday in October, pressing his palm flat against the stone and declaring it warm. Silas came over and pressed his own hand to the rock face. The stone was cool, but the air coming from the crack was not. It was faint and damp and carried something mineral the way a creek smells before you can see it. Silas put his face to the gap and breathed it in. "Mayra," he said, without turning around, "come here and tell me what you smell." Myra wiped her hands on her apron and came to stand beside him. She bent toward the crack and breathed. Her orc senses, sharper than a human's when it came to earth and mineral and water, read the air the way a musician reads a chord. She straightened up and looked at the gap with the exact expression she wore when she was working out a problem she did not yet have all the pieces to. "Water," she said. "Warm water. Iron and something else. Not bad, just strong." The crack ran vertically from about knee height to well above Silas's head, perhaps 7 feet tall at its tallest reach. The width was irregular, wider at the middle than at the top or bottom. Silas slid his arm into the shoulder and felt nothing but cool stone on the near side and warmer air beyond. He could not reach the far wall. "Could be a cavity," he said. "Could be quite small. Could be quite large," Mayra said. Owen was already trying to squeeze himself in. "Owen," Mayra said, and he stopped, and they stood there for a time. Silas was thinking about the effort involved and what it might come to nothing. Myra was thinking about something else entirely, though she did not say what yet. The wind came through the pass and pushed at their backs. "It could be a danger," Silas said. "Bad air, a drop-off." "Could be," Mayra said. "Probably nothing." "Probably," she agreed. But neither of them moved away. There was a practical argument against going in. They had wood to split and a harness to mend, and a half-finished letter to Myra's people in the eastern settlements that had been sitting on the table for a week. A gap in a rock face was not a task on any list. Silas was a man who worked from lists, and yet the warmth of that air against his face in the middle of an October morning, the smell of it, something living and mineral and entirely out of place in that granite wall, had lodged in him the way Owen's frogs lodged in the boy's pockets. He could not put it down. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will trim the lantern wick and we will have a look. If it is nothing, it is nothing." "If it is nothing, it is nothing," Mayra agreed, and Owen looked at both of them with the composed expression of a boy who had already decided it was not nothing. Silas trimmed the wick that evening and cleaned the lantern glass until it threw a clean circle of light. He said nothing about the crack at supper. Mayra said nothing either, but she packed a length of rope in the morning, and when Silas saw it coiled on the bench by the door, he did not ask why. They went to the crack after the morning chores, the three of them, the lantern lit and the rope over Silas's shoulder. Silas went first with the lantern, Owen close behind, because nothing short of a direct order would have held him back, and even a direct order would have been a temporary measure at best. Mayra came last, turning sideways in the gap, her broad orc shoulders pressing against the stone on both sides. The stone received them. The passage ran 40 feet exactly. Silas paced it twice, shoulders turned sideways, lantern held before him, the stone pressing cool against his chest and back. For the first 20 feet, It was tight, and he moved slowly, testing each step for solid footing and keeping his breathing measured. Owen had gone ahead without hesitation, his small half-orc body slipping through spaces that gave his father difficulty, the lantern light barely reaching him before he disappeared around a slight leftward bend in the stone. Then the passage opened. Not all at once and not dramatically. The walls simply stepped back, first to arm's width, then to the width of a doorframe. Then, as Silas came around the bend and Myra pressed in behind him, to a space that stopped them both in their tracks. They stood at the edge of a stone basin, perhaps 30 feet across at its widest, and somewhere between 15 and 20 feet high at the apex of the ceiling, which was not entirely ceiling at all, but a series of fractured granite slabs laid against each other at angles that filtered the outside light through a dozen narrow fissures. The light that came down was indirect and thin, but real, and had caught the moisture in the air so that the whole space had a faint luminosity that was nothing like lantern light and nothing like daylight either. It was something between, something that had no name because nobody had needed to name it before. Owen was standing in the middle of the basin, arms out, head back, looking up at the fissured ceiling with an expression that Silas had never seen on a child's face before, and would spend years trying to describe to people who had not been there. It was wonder, but it was more than wonder. It was the look of a boy who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for, and recognizes it instantly. The seep was along the eastern wall, a stretch of stone perhaps, 8 feet long, where water wept steadily from a horizontal crack and ran in a thin, bright ribbon down to a natural stone lip, and then into a basin perhaps 2 feet across and 6 inches deep before finding its way through it. Lower crack in the floor, the water was clear when Silas put his fingers in it. It was warm, not hot, but warm as creek water in midsummer. And it was October. He looked at Myra. Myra looked at him. She knelt and cupped water in her green hands and tasted it. She tilted her head in that considering way she had, the way that meant she was filing information into a system of understanding that she would share when she was ready and not before. Iron, she said, and something else. Not bad, just strong. It is clean. The floor of the basin was uneven granite with several shallow depressions and one long flat stretch that might, with work, accommodate a pair of bedrolls comfortably. Along the northern wall, the rock had been worked at by water and time into a series of deep ledges, natural shelves between 18 inches and 3 feet deep, each one roughly level. The air was mild, not the warmth of a fire, but the steady, ambient warmth of deep stone that has been seeping heat for longer than anyone could reckon. Silas stood still and let himself feel it. After 3 years of cold nights on the shelf above, the warmth felt almost unearned. Owen had found a patch of green along the base of the eastern wall near the seep, a low mat of some small-leafed plant that had no business surviving this far from sunlight, fed by the mineral water and the warmth rising from the stone. He was crouching over it, poking it gently with one finger. "It is alive," he said. "It is growing." Some things, Myra said, looking at the green mat, and then at her green hands, and then at her son's half-green face in the fissured light. Find a way. They stayed an hour that first morning. Silas walked the perimeter twice with the lantern, measuring in paces, pressing his hands to the walls, looking up at the fissured light. Myra sat on the long, flat stretch of floor and was quiet in a way she rarely was outside, where there was always wind. Owen collected 3 small white pebbles from the basin floor and put them in his pocket. When they came out, blinking into the gray October morning, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped another degree. Silas turned and looked at the crack in the granite with new eyes. "It is ours," he said. "Not as a claim, more as a recognition." "It was always ours," Myra said. "We just did not know it yet." The work began on a Monday because Silas Heart was not a man to let wonder sit idle when there was still good daylight and a solid back. The first task was air. He spent 2 days outside on the upper granite face with a cold chisel and a hammer, following the line of fissures with his hands until he found 2 that could be widened without compromising the stone above. He worked carefully, a 1/4 inch at a time, checking below between each strike. where Mayra stood in the basin with the lantern, watching the ceiling for any sign of stress or crumbling. The light that came through after the second day's work was a clean column, thin as a handspan, falling straight to the basin floor in a bright rod that moved across the stone as the sun moved overhead. Owen stood in it and said it felt like standing in a warm room with a window open. Myra stood in it and held her green hands up into the beam and watched the light pass through her fingers, and she said nothing, but her face held an expression Silas had seen only twice before. Once when Owen was born, and once when she had looked at the shelf of land for the first time and said, "It will do." The expression of a woman who has found something she did not know she needed and is not yet ready to say so. Mayra addressed the seep wall. She spent 3 mornings with a tin cup and a flat stone, redirecting the water's path along the stone lip and building up a small levee of river clay she had hauled in a bucket through the passage. Her orc hands worked the clay with a sureness that came from somewhere deeper than training. The Eastern settlement women had built with clay and stone for generations, shaping walls and ovens and water channels with the same patient skill that human women brought to needlework. By the 3rd day, Myra had the water running in a controlled channel along the eastern wall, pooling in the natural basin rather than losing itself immediately to the lower crack. The pool was never more than 8 inches deep, but it held, and it was warm and it was clean enough for washing. For the natural shelves along the northern wall, Silas built frames from pine he had cut weeks earlier and finished drying in the cabin rafters, then carried through the passage in sections short enough to manage the bend. Mayra notched the frames to sit level on the uneven stone, her hands strong enough to hold the wood steady while Silas drove the pegs. They lined 3 shelves with split pine planks. The result was rough but solid, and by the end of October they had root vegetables, dried herbs, 2 crocks of preserved beans, and a small tin of rendered lard stored on the cool lower shelf, and the cabin's full winter supply of dried meat on the upper shelf. Out of the weather for the first time since they had built the place. The sleeping nook was Silas's idea, and Myra's execution. Against the western curve of the basin wall, where the warmth of the stone was most constant, they built a platform of planks on low pine legs to keep the bedding off the stone. Mayra stitched a curtain of heavy wool from a blanket she had worn threadbare on one side, and hung it on a rod of bent wire so that the nook was curtained off from the rest of the basin. She put their second set of bedding in it, the good quilts her people had sent from the eastern settlements, and a folded sheepskin for Owen. The first night they slept inside the basin, Owen fell asleep before Silas had finished trimming the lantern. The boy curled on the sheepskin with his collection of white pebbles arranged in a careful row on the edge of the sleeping platform. 3 small stones that were the first things he had brought into this place, and that he would not allow to be moved. Mayra lay on her side in the dark, listening to the sound of the seep, which was a very small sound, continuous and even, and said quietly that it sounded like rain, without any of the trouble rain usually brought. Silas said that was about right. They were quiet for a while. The basin held the silence differently than the cabin did. In the cabin, silence was always underlaid by wind. Here, the silence was complete, except for the seep, and the seep was part of the silence rather than an interruption of it. It was the difference between the quiet of a place that is empty and the quiet of a place that is full. "Silas," Mayra said in the dark, "yes, this is the first place I have been warm all the way through since I left the settlements." He reached across the space between them and found her hand. Her green fingers closed around his. They were warm. Everything in this place was warm. "Me too," he said. 2 weeks after they first entered the crack, Silas rode down to the Pruitt place on a Wednesday to return a borrowed auger. Hank Pruitt was at the fence line mending wire and asked how the shelf land was holding up for winter. "Well enough," Silas said, and nothing more. He did not mention the crack. He did not mention what they had found inside it. He rode home thinking about why he had said nothing, and decided it was not dishonesty. Some things needed to be understood by the people who lived them before they were spoken aloud to anyone else. And there was another reason he did not examine too closely. The basin was a place where his orc wife and his half-orc son, and he himself, existed without the weight of anyone else's opinion about what they were. In the basin, there was no talk about the human man with the green wife. There was no curiosity about the boy whose skin could not decide what color it wanted to be. There was only the seep and the light and the warm stone and the work they were doing together. Sharing it with the valley meant sharing it with the valley's opinions, and Silas was not yet ready for that. The kitchen shelf was the last piece of the first round of work. Mayra did not want to cook inside the basin. The smoke would collect in the fissures and cause problems, but she built a preparation shelf in the first widened section of the passage, where it was broad enough to stand in a plank shelf at working height, where she could sort and cut and prepare before carrying things out to the cooking fire above. She hung 2 hooks on the stone above it for her knife and a cloth towel. She put a small clay crock of salt in the corner. The shelf was simple and functional, and it transformed the passage from a way in to a part of the home, a room with a purpose, connected to the rooms on either side. One morning in early November, Owen ate his breakfast porridge, sitting cross-legged on the basin floor, watching the column of light move across the stone above him. He had been counting the white pebbles in his collection, which now numbered 11. "Papa," he said, "do you think anybody else in the whole territory has a place like this?" Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fissured light and the seep wall and his son's half-green face and his wife's green hands wrapped around a tin cup of the mineral water she had come to prefer over creek water. "No," he said, "I do not believe they do." Owen nodded, satisfied, and went back to his pebbles. The second piece of discovery came from Myra's own observation, which she had been sitting on for several days and now decided Silas needed to know. The small-leafed plant along the seep wall had spread. When she measured it in January, it had covered perhaps 4 square feet. By the first week of February, it covered nearly 8. It had crept toward the column of light that Silas had widened in the fissures above, and the growth closest to the light was greener and more robust than the rest. She had brought in a seed tin in October with kitchen herb seeds she had been planning to start in the cabin window, and on an impulse, she had pressed several seeds into the damp clay along the seep wall near the warmest stretch of stone. She had been checking them quietly, telling no one, visiting the seep wall each morning while Silas split wood above and Owen fed the animals. Every seed had sprouted. She showed Silas on a cold morning in February, crouching by the eastern wall with the lantern pointing to the small upright shoots, 6 of them, all green, all alive. In the first week of February, when the ground outside was frozen 8 inches down and the temperature at night had not risen above 12 degrees in a month, Silas crouched beside her and looked at the shoots for a long time. He reached out and touched one with his fingertip, gently, the way you touch something you are not entirely sure is real. "Do not tell anyone about these," he said finally. "I had not planned to," Mayra said. She looked at the shoots with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has tested a hypothesis and been proven right. The Orc settlements had a tradition of underground growing root cellars and cave gardens where the Eastern women had cultivated herbs and vegetables through winters that would have killed anything above ground. Mayra had not spoken about this tradition to Silas because she had not been sure it would work here, in different stone, with different water, at different altitude. Now she was sure. The basin was not just a shelter. It was soil. It was light. It was warmth. It was everything a growing thing needed, arranged by the mountain itself into a garden that had been waiting for someone to plant it. On the 15th of November, before the seeds had been planted, before the spreading green had been measured, Hank Pruitt rode up to the shelf with his eldest son to return a saw Silas had lent in September. He found Silas working at the granite face with a chisel and asked what on earth he was doing. Silas looked at the crack, then at Hank, then made a decision. "Come and see," he said. Hank Pruitt was a practical man who did not give compliments easily or often. He stood in the basin for 4 minutes without saying a word. He looked at the seep and the shelves, and the column of light and the curtained sleeping nook and Owen's row of white pebbles on the sleeping platform. Then he said, "Lord Almighty, Silas." That was the moment Silas understood that what they had was not just remarkable to themselves, it was remarkable, period. The kind of remarkable that changes the way people look at you, which is both a gift and a danger, depending on who is doing the looking. Word moved through a valley the way water moves, finding its own level and getting into places you would not expect. By December, 3 families knew about the hidden basin, and by January, 2 more. Most came by invitation on Silas's terms, an afternoon visit where he brought them through the passage and showed them the seep and the shelves and the column of light. And they stood in the basin and breathed the mild air and looked at Myra's curtained sleeping nook and went home with something changed in their expressions, something opened, as though they had been shown a room in a house they thought they knew and discovered it had been there all along. Not everyone came away convinced that the change was good. Jeremiah Croft ranched 6 miles north of the pass and was the closest thing Granite Pass had to a voice of authority, not by any official position, but by length of tenure in the valley and by the volume at which he expressed opinions. He had arrived in the territory in 1871, which was 16 years ago, and he spoke about those 16 years the way some men speak about a military campaign, with the assumption that having survived them entitled him to certain privileges of judgment. He had opinions about land use and proper settlement practice, and about who belonged in the territory and who did not. His opinions about the second category had hardened over the years into something that was not quite prejudice and not quite principle, but occupied the uncomfortable ground between the two, where most unexamined beliefs reside. When word of the Heart Basin reached him through his wife, who had heard it from the Pruitts, his first reaction was skepticism. His second reaction was something less agreeable, though he would not have described it that way. What he would have said, if asked, was that he was concerned about proper procedure, concerned about mineral rights, concerned about a man who had been in the territory only 3 years claiming something extraordinary on ground that Croft had ridden past for 16 years without noticing. What he did not say, because he did not examine it closely enough to put it into words, was that part of his discomfort had to do with who was doing the claiming. A human man with an orc wife and a half-breed son, living on marginal land that Croft had always considered barely worth the filing fee, had found something remarkable inside a rock formation that Croft had dismissed as worthless granite for nearly 2 decades. The discovery itself was an irritant. The fact that it had been made by people Croft considered beneath his notice was something worse. He rode to the shelf in January on a cold, clear afternoon, and Silas showed him the crack and offered to take him through. Croft looked at the crack for a long moment. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not want to acknowledge, but cannot ignore. Then he looked at Silas, and past Silas to where Mayra stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching them, her green face unreadable and her amber eyes steady. "That is a mine entry," Croft said. "You file a mineral claim?" "It is not a mine," Silas said. "There is no ore. It is a natural basin. You are drawing water from it for the household. It is our land. Your cabin claim is on the shelf above," Croft said. "The rock face is a separate matter." "You file on the rock face?" Silas had not felled on the rock face. His cabin claim covered the shelf and the acreage surrounding it, but he had not specifically included the granite formation in the filing. It had not occurred to him the crack was in the rock that bordered his claim on the east. Whether it fell within the claim boundaries, or at the edge of them, or technically outside them, was a question he had not asked because he had not known there was an answer needed. Croft knew that. Silas could see that. He knew it. The way a man sees a fence post that is slightly out of plumb and decides whether to mention it or remember it for later. "I am just asking questions," Croft said. "A man has a right to ask questions." He rode back down without asking to see the inside. Myra watched him go from the cabin doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face carrying an expression Silas had learned to read over 3 years of marriage. It was the expression she wore when she had identified a problem and was waiting to see whether Silas had identified it too. "He is going to make trouble," she said. "He was asking questions. He was measuring the distance between what you have and what you filed, and he is going to use the gap." Silas looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right because he had felt it in Croft's voice, in the careful way the man had used the word separate, in the specific precision of his questions. Croft had not come to learn about the basin. He had come to learn about the paperwork. The following week, Silas rode to Granite Pass and found the land agent, a young man named Carroll, who wore a city coat and kept meticulous files. Silas asked to see the boundary records for his claim. Carroll pulled the file. At first glance, the eastern boundary of the Heart claim appeared to run along the base of the granite formation, which would have meant the face itself, and everything behind it, lay outside the formal claim. Silas sat with that for a moment, feeling the particular cold that comes not from weather, but from the realization that something you thought was solid has a crack in it. What would it take, Silas said carefully, to amend the claim to include the rock face? Carroll explained the amendment process. It required a survey notation and a filing fee, and if the acreage involved was under 5 acres, it could be handled locally without referral to the district land office. Carroll estimated the basin at somewhere between a 1/4 acre and 1 acre, based on Silas's description. That was well within local jurisdiction. How long? Silas asked. /6 weeks minimum, Carroll said. If there are no competing claims filed in the interval. Silas rode home in the dark, which he did not like to do, thinking about the phrase competing claims and what Croft had understood about the gap in his paperwork, and whether understanding was the same as intention. If you have ever watched someone try to take what another family built with their own hands, you need to hear what happens next. Hit subscribe to Human and Orc Girl History right now. Tap that like button. What comes next changed everything. The competing claim arrived at Carroll's office on the 4th of February, filed by one Jeremiah Croft, citing the rock formation along the eastern boundary of the Heart Shelf, claim as prospectively mineral-bearing ground, and applying for a preliminary mineral survey under the mining laws. Carroll sent word to Silas by way of the Pruitt boy, who made the ride in 2 hours and arrived cold and apologetic, as though he were personally responsible for the news. Silas thanked him, fed him a bowl of stew, and sent him back with a reply that he would come to town by the end of the week. Mayra heard the details that evening after Owen was asleep in the basin sleeping nook, where he had taken to spending most nights, because the warmth and the sound of the seep had become as necessary to his sleep as the sheepskin and the quilts. She sat at the cabin table with her hands folded and listened to all of it. Her green face showed nothing. Her amber eyes showed everything. "He has no mineral claim," she said. "There is no ore." "He has a preliminary survey application," Silas said. "The application creates standing. The survey would determine whether there is basis for the claim. If the surveyor says no mineral content, the claim fails. But while the survey is pending, any improvements we make to the rock face could be contested as encroachments on claimed land." Mayra was quiet for a moment. The candle on the table flickered in a draft from the gap in the chinking, the gap that the basin's warmth had made irrelevant. "So we stop work," she said, "for now. And if the surveyor finds no mineral content, which he will because there is none, then the claim fails and we proceed with the amendment." "And if Croft finds another angle in the interval?" Silas had no answer for that, because it was the question he had been sitting with since the Pruitt boy had handed him the note. And there was something about the basin that had gotten under Croft's skin in a way that went past the land question. Silas had seen it in the man's eyes when he had looked at the crack and declined to go in. Croft was not a man who liked being surprised by the ground he thought he understood. He had spent 16 years forming opinions about what this valley would and would not yield, and a warm, hidden basin with mineral water and a family sleeping comfortably through a Montana winter was not consistent with those opinions. It was especially not consistent when the family in question included an Orc woman and a half-Orc child. Croft had never said anything directly about Mayra. He did not need to. The valley knew where he stood on the question of mixed families, the way it knew where he stood on everything else, loudly and without invitation. That evening, Silas went to the basin alone, after supper, and sat in the dark with the lantern unlit. He could hear the seep. He could feel the warmth of the stone around him. He thought about filing claims and survey schedules and the particular cruelty of being shown something extraordinary and then told to wait and see if it was allowed. He sat there long enough for the cold of the stone floor to work through his trousers, and then he lit the lantern and looked around the basin in the low gold light. Mayra's curtain hung straight in the still air. Owen's 3 original white pebbles sat on the edge of the sleeping platform where he had left them. The morning he moved his collection to a proper shelf. The herb shoots along the seep wall were invisible from here, but Silas knew where they were. He knew where every worked edge and fitted plank and redirected channel of water was in this space, because he had helped make each one. That was the thing about a place you had made. It was not possible to be indifferent to it in the way you could be indifferent to a piece of land you had only stood on. The making was inside you. Every notch in a pine frame and every bucket of clay hauled through the passage was part of the reckoning now. And losing it would not be losing a location, it would be losing the thing the location had allowed them to become. A family that worked together. A couple that built together. A boy who was half of two worlds and comfortable in both, because this place did not require him to choose. He was not a man who prayed formally, but he sat in the warm dark of the basin and asked plainly for the right outcome. Then he got up and went back through the passage to make breakfast, because the morning still required it. Mayra was already up when he came into the cabin. She was standing at the table with the claim file and the original survey map, which she had asked Carol to copy for her in January without telling Silas why. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." She had been measuring not the basin alone, but the relationship between the basin's position in the rock and the surface boundary markers of the original claim. She had done the arithmetic 3 times in her careful, even hand, using the Orc counting method her grandmother had taught her, which worked in base 12 rather than base 10, and which she had long ago learned to translate into the human system for paperwork purposes. "The basin," she said, "is inside our boundary." Silas looked at the map and the numbers Mayra had written on the side of it in her even, unhurried hand. She walked him through the calculation twice, slowly pointing to each reference point in turn. The original Heart claim boundary on the east ran along the base of the granite formation. That much Carol had first inferred. But the basin was not behind the formation. It was inside it. The granite ridge itself was part of the claim. The passage that led to the basin ran horizontally into the ridge, not past it. And the ridge, as measured from the surface boundary markers that Silas had set himself 3 years ago, fell within the claim on all sides. "The crack opens into the face," Mayra said. "The basin is inside the rock that sits on our land." Croft filed on the rock face, Silas said. He filed on a mineral survey of ground he described as adjacent to your eastern boundary, Mayra said. "Not inside it. If the basin is inside the ridge, and the ridge is inside the claim, then there is no adjacent ground to survey." Silas looked at the numbers again. He was not a surveyor, but he was a man who had set those boundary markers himself, and knew the ground between them in the way you know ground you have crossed on foot in every season. The eastern marker was a flat granite stone he had placed at the corner of the formation, not at its base, at its corner, which meant the formation itself was inside the marker. He looked at Mayra. She looked back at him with the expression she wore when she had known a thing for a while and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "Since January, when I asked Carol for the map?" "You did not tell me." "I was not certain until I measured 3 times. I am certain now." Silas rode to Carol's office the next morning with Mayra's map and her calculations and laid them on the desk. Carol studied them for a long time, turning the map and returning to the numbers. He was a methodical man, which was what you wanted in a land agent, and he did not speak until he had worked through the arithmetic himself on a separate sheet. "If this measurement is accurate," Carol said finally, "the eastern boundary marker encompasses the granite formation which would place the interior cavity within the existing claim. There would be no basis for an adjacent mineral survey, because the ground is not adjacent, it is interior. Is the measurement accurate?" Silas asked. "I would need to verify in the field," Carol said, "but the marker locations are on record, and the numbers align with the recorded survey. I believe it is accurate." Aldous Beck, the territorial surveyor, rode out to Granite Pass on the 5th of March, as scheduled, accompanied by Carol and by Silas, and without Jeremiah Croft, who had not been invited and who arrived at the claim boundary to find all three of them already at work with measuring chains. Beck was a weathered man of few words who had been conducting land surveys in Montana Territory for 11 years and who appeared entirely unbothered by the circumstances. He set his chains, read his instruments, and recorded his measurements in a notebook that he did not show to anyone. He asked to see the formation. Silas walked him to the crack. Beck looked at the crack, then at his notebook, then back at the crack. "This goes in?" he asked. "/40 feet, Silas said. Beck looked at Croft, who was standing 20 yards back at the boundary, watching. "The formation from corner marker to corner marker," Beck said, confirming his own notation rather than asking, "is entirely within the filed boundaries of the Heart homestead claim." He wrote something in his notebook. "There is no ground exterior to that claim available for a mineral survey, as described in the Croft application. The application is without basis." He closed the notebook. Croft said nothing. He stood at the boundary for another minute, his face working through an expression that moved from anger through calculation to something that finally settled into the particular blankness of a man who has overplayed his hand and knows it. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the valley without a word. Carol filed the formal, finding the following week in Silas's amendment, adding the geological formation to the explicit language of the claim, was approved within 30 days. The document came back with a land office seal and Carol's signature at the bottom. Silas brought it home and put it on the table, and Owen traced the seal with his finger and asked what it meant. "It means this is ours," Silas told him. "It was always ours," Owen said. "Yes," Silas said. "But now the paper agrees." He looked at Myra across the table. She was pouring hot water into the teapot from the kettle, her green hand steady around the handle, her face carrying no expression of triumph or satisfaction, just the quiet composure of a woman who had done the math, checked it 3 times, and handed it to the right people at the right time. "Thank you," he said. She set the teapot on the table and looked at him. "For what?" "For seeing what I did not see, for measuring what I did not think to measure." Mayra poured the tea. "You set the markers," she said. "I just read where you put them." It was a generous interpretation, they both knew that. But it was also the way they worked, the way they had always worked, each of them seeing what the other missed, each of them covering the ground the other had not thought to walk. A human man and an orc woman looking at the same mountain from different angles and finding between the two views the complete picture. The scene of the sun removed from it, out of the last water. Died until that bathe had been in Mars, and left it for you, without having. The spring of 1888 was the best season the Heart place had seen in 4 years. The herb garden along the seep wall had expanded to cover nearly 15 feet of the eastern wall by May, a lush ribbon of green against the dark stone that looked like something from a dream about a place that should not exist. Mayra had added onion starts, a trial row of small radishes, and 3 tomato plants she'd grown as seedlings in the cabin window before transferring them to the warmth of the basin in April. The tomatoes were small and slow, but by July 2 of the 3 were bearing fruit, which was not something Mayra had ever managed on the shelf above, where the growing season was short and the nights cold even in midsummer. The orc women of the eastern settlements had been growing food underground for generations. Cave gardens and root cellars and stone chambers where warmth and water could be controlled and the seasons overhead could be ignored. Myra had carried that knowledge with her when she left the settlements, folded into her memory the way the seed tin had been folded into her trunk. She had not known whether it would work here, in different stone, with different water, at different altitude. Now she knew. The basin was not a cave garden in the settlement tradition, but the principles were the same. Warmth from below, water from the stone, light from above, managed and directed. The mountain had built the infrastructure. Mayra had supplied the knowledge, and the seeds had done what seeds do when they are given what they need. Silas widened the upper fissures another hand's width in April, using better technique than he had the first time, working with a lighter chisel and more patience. and the column of light was now broad enough that it split into two distinct pillars. In the afternoon, the basin had a quality of illumination that visitors routinely stopped and remarked upon. A soft angled light that fell across the stone and the green plants and the water in the pool in a way that made the space feel not like a cavern, but like a room with very unusual windows. The Pruitt family came in May with their 4 children, all of whom pressed through the passage with the excited terror of children entering a place they had been told about, but did not quite believe was real. The Alderson family from the north end of the valley came in June, and after each visit the same thing happened, which was that the visitors stood in the basin, in the mild air, in the angled light, and said some version of the same thing, which was that they would not have believed it if they had not seen it. Hank Pruitt, on his second visit, stood at the seep wall looking at the tomato plants. He looked at them for a long time. He reached out and touched one of the small green tomatoes with his fingertip, gently, the way Silas had touched the first herb shoots months earlier, with the careful disbelief of a man who is touching evidence of something he did not think was possible. "You know what this valley has been saying about your ground for 10 years, Silas?" Hank said. "I know what it has been saying," Silas said. "Well?" Hank looked at the tomatoes, then at Myra, who was standing by the seep wall with her arms crossed and her amber eyes steady in the faintest suggestion of a smile on her green face. It was wrong. Myra was at the preparation shelf in the passage, working through a crock of dried beans. When she heard Hank say it was wrong, she smiled to herself in the way she smiled when she had known a thing for a while and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. It was the smile of a woman who had heard the valley's opinions about her husband's land and her husband's half-orc son, and who had answered all of those opinions not with argument, but with tomatoes growing in a stone basin in the middle of winter. There was no better rebuttal than fruit. The word that moved through the valley after the Pruitt and Alderson visits was different from the word that had moved before. The earlier talk had been about curiosity and wonder, a hidden basin, warm water. Imagine that. The new talk was about something more practical and more unsettling to the people who had spent years dismissing the Heart place as marginal ground, worked by a man who had married an orc and produced a child who was neither one thing nor the other. The new talk was about value. The Heart place had value, not the value of gold or silver or anything the mining laws could claim, but the value of a place that could grow food when the ground above was frozen, that could keep a family warm when the wind outside was trying to kill them, that could store provisions without the rot and the mice and the damp that ruined half the valley's winter supplies every year. It was the kind of value that could not be measured in dollars, but that every family in the territory understood in their bones, because they had all spent winters without it. And the family that had found this value, that had built the shelves and redirected the water and planted the seeds and hung the curtain and widened the light, was a family that the valley had been quietly condescending to for 3 years. A human man with bad land and an orc wife, and a boy who collected white pebbles. The discovery did not erase the condescension, but it reframed it in a way that made some people uncomfortable, which was, in Myra's private opinion, exactly what condescension deserved. By the second summer, the Heart place had become a destination. Not a public one, not a tourist attraction or a point of interest on any map, but a place that people in the valley knew about and talked about and occasionally rode 11 miles to see. Not because they were invited, but because they were curious, and because curiosity in a territory where most of the landscape was already known and accounted for was a rare and valuable commodity. Myra managed the visits with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. She did not turn anyone away, but she did not encourage lingering. She showed them the basin and the seep and the garden in the light, and she answered their questions with the patient precision of a woman who understood that every question was also an opportunity to demonstrate competence, and that competence was the most effective answer to prejudice that she had ever found. People who came expecting to find a curiosity found instead a system, a water management system, a food storage system, a climate control system, all of it built by 2 people with hand tools and patience, and the willingness to look at a crack in a rock and see something other than a crack in a rock. Some of the visitors looked at Myra differently after their visit. Not with warmth exactly, not with the sudden conversion of people who have seen the error of their ways, but with a recalibration, a small but perceptible shift in the way they held her in their understanding of who she was and what she was capable of. She noticed these shifts and filed them away without comment. She had learned a long time ago that demanding acknowledgement was less effective than simply being undeniable. There was one visit that Myra remembered more clearly than the others. In August of that second summer, a woman named Elspeth Cray rode up to the shelf alone. She was the wife of a rancher from the south end of the valley, a quiet woman who had never spoken to Myra at the trading post, and who Myra had assumed shared the valley's general indifference to the orc woman on the ridge. Elspeth stood in the basin for a long time without speaking. She looked at the seep wall and the garden and the light and the sleeping nook and Owen's pebbles on the shelf. Then she turned to Myra and said something that Myra carried with her for years afterward. "I have lived in this territory for 12 years, Elspeth said. I have spent every one of those winters cold, and every one of those summers fighting the soil, and every one of those autumns wondering whether the provisions would last. And I have never once thought to look inside the rock." She paused. Her eyes were bright and her voice was steady. "You looked inside the rock, you found what was there, and you made it into something. And I want you to know that I see what that took. Not just the work, the seeing, the willingness to look at a thing everyone else had already decided about and decide differently." Myra did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to being seen in that particular way, not as an orc or as a wife or as a curiosity, but as a person who had done something worth acknowledging. She said thank you, and Elspeth nodded, and they stood together in the basin in the mild air for another minute without speaking. Two women from two different worlds, breathing the same warm mineral air in a space that neither world had known existed until a 7-year-old boy pressed his ear against the stone. By the end of that second summer, the basin had become more than a shelter or a storage room or even a garden. It had become the center of the Heart homestead in a way that the cabin above had never quite managed. The cabin was where they cooked and ate and kept their tools and their papers and the daily machinery of frontier life. The basin was where they lived, where they slept and grew things and sat in the warm quiet and listened to the seep and felt the stone's ancient heat against their backs, and did not need to explain themselves to anyone. Owen spent most of his time there when he was not doing chores. Above, he had claimed the eastern corner near the seep wall as his own territory, arranging his pebble collection on a shelf Silas had built for him at the boy's eye level. The collection had grown to 23 pebbles, each one white, each one smooth, each one selected from the basin floor with a care that bordered on ceremony. Owen could tell you where he had found each one, and on what day and what the light had been doing when he picked it up. The pebbles were his record of the basin, the way Myra's seed tin was her record of the settlements, and Silas's boundary markers were his record of the claim. Each person in the family had their own way of saying, "This is mine," and each way was different, and together they made a language that only the three of them spoke. On a warm evening in July, Owen Hart sat at the edge of the stone pool in the basin, with his collection of white pebbles arranged in a careful row beside him. He was counting the tomatoes on the vine, touching each one with his fingertip and whispering a number. The column of light from above had shifted to gold as the sun moved west. The seep ran its quiet, continuous note, the small, steady sound that had become the soundtrack of Owen's childhood, as familiar to him as his own breathing. Silas was at the plank shelf in the passage, sharpening a tool. The steady rasp of metal on stone carried through the opening and mixed with the sound of the water. Myra was somewhere above, on the shelf of land outside the cabin, singing to herself in the old orc tongue, a song her grandmother had taught her in the eastern settlements. Her voice came down through the fissures in the granite, filtered by stone into something that sounded less like singing and more like the mountain itself, humming. Owen listened to all of it, his father's steady rasp, his mother's voice, the water, three sounds that together made a fourth, which was the sound of a family in a place that belonged to them, doing the things that families do when they are not performing for anyone and do not need to justify their existence to a single soul. He added one more pebble to the row. The stone was warm. Everything just now was exactly enough. Not too much and not too little. Not the dramatic abundance of a rich man's table or the desperate scarcity of a poor one. Just enough. Enough warmth from the stone. Enough light from the fissures. Enough water from the seep. Enough food growing on the wall. Enough love between the three people who lived here. Quiet and unshowy and expressed through work rather than words. The love of people who had chosen each other across a distance of race and background and expectation, and had built something from the choosing that was stronger than any of the opinions the valley had offered about whether it would last. Enough. The words sat in the warm air of the basin like one of Owen's white pebbles, small and smooth, and placed exactly where it belonged. Outside, the evening light was fading over Granite Pass. The wind was picking up in the way it always did at this hour, coming through the gap between the ridges with the sound of something searching. But inside the basin, there was no wind. There was only the seep and the light and the green growing things along the wall, and a boy with his pebbles and his parents' voices braided together through 40 feet of stone. The crack in the granite was no wider than a man's shoulders. It went straight back into the mountain for 40 feet. On the other side of those 40 feet was a world that no one had known was there until a 7-year-old boy pressed his ear against the stone and said he heard water. His mother, an Orc woman who had come to Montana with a seed tin and a composed expression and the knowledge of generations of underground growers folded into her memory, had thought he was imagining things. His father, a human man who had filed a claim on ground everyone said was worthless, had reached for the lantern. Between the three of them, the boy who listened, the mother who knew, and the father who was willing to look, they had found something the mountain had been keeping for them. Not gold, not silver, not any of the things the mining laws were built to claim. Just warmth and water and light in a place where things could grow. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story sat with you, subscribe to Human and Orc Girl History so you never miss another one. Tap the like button if you think the hearts earned their hidden world, and leave a comment telling me which moment you will carry with you. Owen's ear against the stone, Myra tasting the water, the first night in the basin, the seeds sprouting in February, Croft's questions, Mayra's map, the paper agreeing Hank Pruitt touching the tomato, or the sound of 3 voices braided through 40 feet of stone. I would love to hear from you. There are more stories coming, and every one of them begins the same way, with someone willing to look at the same ground twice.